Gravel skittered down the canyon wall as Elias hooked his arms under the boy's shoulders and dragged. Dust choked the air. A warning shot cracked off limestone, followed by the heavy thud of approaching hooves. Blood soaked both their coats, dark and warm. On the boy's wrist, a tarnished silver armband caught the slanting light, the chief's only heir. Elias could drop him here, walk to his tired horse, ride west and survive. Instead, he tore a strip from his late wife's faded blue scarf, cinched it tight around the bleeding gash, and hauled the dead weight upward. Every muscle burned. Every step deeper into the Badlands was a promise he hadn't asked to make. The scouts weren't hunting the boy anymore, they were hunting the man who carried him. If he crossed the dry creek bed, there would be no turning back. Would one broken stranger's life force an entire nation to bend the knee or bury him in the dust? Gravel skittered down the canyon wall as Elias hooked his arms under the boy's shoulders and dragged. Dust choked the air, thick and metallic, tasting of crushed sage and old rain. A warning shot cracked off the limestone, the sharp report echoing off the fractured walls like a judge's gavel striking wood. The heavy thud of approaching hooves followed, rhythmic and relentless, vibrating through the soles of his worn boots. Blood soaked both their coats, dark and warm against the oppressive 1881 Cimarron Basin heat. On the boy's wrist, a tarnished silver armband caught the slanting afternoon light. Elias didn't need to study the carved hawk and twisted pine to know what it meant. It was the mark of the Arapaho High Chief. The boy was the chief's only heir, and he was bleeding out in the dust. The fractured Badlands stretched like cracked bone beneath his scuffed boots, shifting like dry ash with every labored step. Sudden dust storms and vanishing springs had long mirrored the fragile truce between Homesteaders and Arapaho bands, a balance now tipping into open violence. The canyon acoustics amplified the sound of his own ragged breathing, turning the basin into a hollow drum that trapped every mistake and magnified every footfall. Heat shimmered off the pale rock, bending the horizon into a liquid mirage that promised water but delivered only thirst. Out here, the land didn't forgive hesitation. It rewarded decisiveness and buried doubt in shallow draws. That uneasy peace was already cracking under the weight of stolen cattle, broken treaty lines, and generations of quiet resentment. Elias felt the historical gravity pressing down on his shoulders. He wasn't just a drifter hauling a bleeding child across hardpan. He was a single spark in a tinderbox of gunpowder and old blood. He could drop him. The thought arrived clean and rational, cutting through the haze of exhaustion and copper-smelling air. His horse was tied 3 miles back, resting in the thin shade of a scraggly mesquite thicket. He could walk to it. He could mount up, ride west past the territorial survey markers, and survive. He had done it before. Out here, survival demanded a quiet heart and calloused eyes. Compassion was a luxury that left good men unmarked and forgotten in unmarked graves. But the canyon floor gave way beneath his left heel, sending them sliding down a steep incline of loose shale. Elias shifted his bleeding grip, fingers slipping against sweat and grit until they locked onto the cold silver of the armband. The metal bit into his palm. It anchored him to a truth he couldn't outrun. Above the ridge, shadows detached themselves from the rock. Scouts. They weren't hunting the boy anymore. They were hunting the white man who had pulled him from the kill zone. Ignoring the cracking rifle shots that pinged off the limestone 50 yards up the slope, Elias faced an instant, suffocating friction. Abandon the wounded stranger and preserve his own fragile safety, or bind the fatal wound and step directly into hostile territory. His hand went to the breast pocket of his oilskin duster. Fingers closed around faded blue cotton. The scarf smelled faintly of lavender and wood smoke, a ghost of a life that had ended 2 winters past. Clara's voice surfaced from memory, quiet but unyielding. You don't measure a man by what he saves when it's easy, Elias. You measure him by what he refuses to leave behind. He had ignored that truth once. He hadn't been fast enough. The guilt of past survival sat heavy in his chest, a river stone he'd carried across 3 territories. Today, it finally found its counterweight. With a sharp tear that split the quiet canyon like a rifle cocking, he ripped a long strip free from the fabric. He pressed the blue cotton hard against the boy's bleeding gash, cinching it tight around the wound with practiced, trembling hands. The boy gasped, a weak, shuddering sound, but his eyes fluttered open, dark, clear, and holding a weight no child should carry. He didn't speak. He just watched. Elias hauled the dead weight upward. Every muscle burned. Every step deeper into the Badlands was a promise he hadn't asked to make. The scarf stayed bound. The choice was locked. Ahead, the dry creek bed cut through the earth like a jagged scar. Cross it, and he'd be past the Homesteader claim lines deep into Arapaho hunting grounds. The wind picked up, sudden and sharp, carving new fault lines in the dust, shifting the geography beneath his boots. Trespass and survival blurred into lethal moral ambiguity. The scouts' hooves drew closer, deliberate now, circling the high ground with tactical patience. They would see the blue cloth, they would see the silver. They would see a white man carrying what they considered sacred, walking straight into the throat of their territory. If he crossed that creek, there would be no turning back. No parley. No retreat to the safety of his own name. He adjusted his grip, felt the faint pulse of the boy's life against his forearm, and stepped toward the ravine. The Badlands held its breath. Would one broken stranger's life force an entire nation to bend the knee or bury him in the dust? Only the wind knew, and the wind did not answer. The dry creek bed offered no mercy, only fractured shale that bit through Elias' boot soles and shifted like loose teeth beneath his weight. He crossed it in 3 grinding steps, the boy's dead weight pulling his shoulders forward with every labored breath. The blue scarf held tight against the wound, but the damp warmth spreading across Elias' forearms told him the bleeding hadn't truly stopped. It had only been delayed. He adjusted his grip, feeling the boy's ribs rise and fall in shallow, uneven drafts against his own chest. The canyon walls narrowed ahead, folding into a steep switchback carved by generations of rain and forgotten trails. The air grew heavier, thick with the scent of sun-baked juniper and crushed saltbush. Every footfall echoed differently here, sharper, more contained, as if the rock itself was listening. He hadn't gone 50 yards up the incline when the gravel crunched ahead of him, deliberate and measured. Not wind, not animal. Boot. Elias froze. He lowered his weight, shifting the boy carefully against his hip, and let his left hand drift toward the worn walnut grip of his Colt. The switchback curved upward, blind around a limestone outcrop. A shadow detached from the rock face, then resolved into a man on foot, leading a dusty paint mare by the reins. The rider wore a frayed duster patched at the elbows, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and a rifle slung across his back with the barrel wrapped in oilcloth. His face was a map of sun lines and old scars, his eyes the color of dried river clay. He didn't reach for his weapon. He didn't need to. His posture said he'd been waiting. "Set that boy down, Elias Thorne," the man said, his voice gravelly and flat, carrying the flat drawl of a man who'd spent more years on the trail than in towns. "Or at least lean him against that rock so you don't bleed out carrying him to your own grave." Elias didn't move his hand from his pistol. He knew that voice. Silas Vance, former Army scout guide for the railroad surveys, now a ghost who rode the borderlands between white claims and native hunting grounds. He knew the trails, the water holes, the politics. More importantly, he knew when to run and when to dig in. "Silas," Elias said, keeping his tone level. "Didn't expect company out here." "Ain't company, it's a reckoning." Silas stepped closer, his boots crunching softly. He stopped 10 paces out, hands resting loosely on his hips. His eyes flicked to the boy's face, then down to the tarnished silver armband peeking from beneath Elias' sleeve. His jaw tightened. "You know what you're holding, don't you?" "I know what he is." "You know what it means," Silas corrected. "Chief's blood, sacred line. You pull him from that ridge, you don't just save a boy. You step into the middle of a war neither side asked for, but both are itching to finish." A gust of hot wind swept down the canyon, carrying grit that stung Elias' eyes. He blinked it away, keeping his voice steady. He was bleeding out. "I wasn't about to watch a kid die in the dirt, because the lines on a treaty paper said I should look away." Silas let out a slow breath, shaking his head. Honor's a fine word, Elias. Sounds good by a campfire, but it doesn't stop bullets. It doesn't stop passes. You cross that salt flat ahead, you mark yourself. Homesteaders out of Cimarron Creek will ride you down for stealing Arapaho property. Tribal scouts will put arrows in your spine for trespassing on burial ground. You'll be hunted by men who share nothing but a desire to see you swing or burn. Elias felt the truth in the words like a physical weight pressing against his ribs. He'd heard the stories. He'd seen the bodies strung up on claim fences. He'd watched good men break over less. But the boy's pulse was a faint, erratic drum against his wrist, slowing with every shallow breath. He could feel the life slipping out of him, measured in heartbeats and fading warmth. Dropping him wouldn't save Elias. It would just leave him alone with a ghost and a debt he'd never pay. "I'm not crossing for glory," Elias said quietly. "And I'm not crossing to die. I'm crossing because leaving him here means I stop being the man she thought I was." Silas studied him for a long moment. The wind whistled through a crack in the rock, low and mournful. Finally, the old scout reached into his coat and pulled out a canteen. He didn't offer it. He just set it on a flat stone between them. "Water's scarce. You'll need it more than me. But listen close, Elias. The salt flats don't forgive hesitation. The ground's hard, the sun's cruel, and there's no cover for 30 miles. If you step onto it, you walk in plain sight. Every posse with a rifle and every scout with a bow will know exactly where to look. You're not just carrying a boy, you're carrying a target." Elias released his grip on his Colt. He reached down with his free hand, fingers brushing the worn leather of his duster, steadying his ragged breathing. The heat pressed down like a physical hand on his shoulders. He could feel every muscle trembling, every tendon stretched thin by the weight and the miles and the gravity of the choice. But beneath the exhaustion, beneath the fear, something older and harder held him upright. It wasn't courage. It was accountability. He had made a promise in blood and cloth, and promises out here didn't expire when the road got steep. He picked up the canteen, unscrewed the cap, let a few drops fall onto the boy's cracked lips. The boy swallowed reflexively, a weak, shuddering motion that told Elias he was still fighting, barely. "I know what's waiting," Elias said. "I've waited. I'll take the salt flats." Silas nodded once, slow and heavy. "Then God keep your boots from dragging and your aim from failing, because once you step onto that white ground, there ain't no riding back." He turned without another word, leading the paint mare back up the switchback. His footsteps faded into the wind, leaving only the echo of gravel and the quiet certainty that the border between survival and ruin had just been crossed. Elias adjusted the boy again, shifting the dead weight higher on his shoulder. His breath came in controlled, measured draws. He forced his shoulders back, set his jaw, and pushed forward. The switchback climbed, narrowed, then opened onto a long, sloping ridge that looked down into a vast, blinding expanse of white. The salt flats stretched to the horizon like a frozen sea, cracked into geometric plates that shimmered under the afternoon sun. Heat waves rose from the surface, distorting the distance into a liquid haze. There was no tree, no boulder, no shadow, only hard-pan, salt crust, and the merciless sky. He took the first step onto the flats. The crust cracked beneath his boot, a sharp sound that carried too far in the stillness. He kept walking. The boy's breathing grew shallower. The blue scarf darkened. Elias felt the pulse at the wrist grow fainter, skipping beats then returning weaker. He adjusted his stride, shortening it to match the rhythm of the boy's fading heart. Every step was a calculation, every breath a negotiation. He couldn't run, he couldn't stop. He could only move forward, carrying the weight of a life that wasn't his to keep but was his to protect. The silence of the flats was absolute, broken only by the scrape of leather, the crack of salt, and the slow, steady rhythm of his own boots. Then a sound that didn't belong, a single cry, then another. High above, black shapes detached from the sky, circling in tight, deliberate loops. Ravens, 3 of them riding the thermal currents, their wings cutting sharp arcs against the blinding white. They weren't feeding, they were watching. The tension that had coiled in Elias' chest snapped. The flats weren't empty, they were never empty. The sky was telling him what the ground couldn't. He looked down at the ridgeline behind him, dust plumes, small, distant but growing, riders moving fast, not one or two, enough to flank, enough to cut him off if he lingered. The salt offered no cover, but the valley beyond it did. A steep drop carved into the earth, shadowed by dense brush and limestone shelves. It was a descent that would tear at his boots and threaten to throw him down with every misstep. But it was the only place where the pursuers couldn't shoot in the open. He didn't hesitate. He angled left, following the edge of the flats where the hardpan gave way to a crumbling escarpment. The drop was 20 feet down to a narrow shelf, then another 30 to the valley floor. Loose rock, no handholds. A mistake meant broken bones or worse. He braced his knees, lowered his center of gravity, and stepped over the edge. The first foothold gave way. He slid, boots scraping against stone, catching himself on a protruding root. The boy's weight pulled him forward. He dug his free hand into the dirt, fingers tearing, breath ragged. He held, pulled himself up, adjusted, stepped down again. The descent was brutal. Each drop forced him to trust the terrain, trust his grip, trust that his body wouldn't fail before his will. The salt flats receded above him, replaced by shadow and the sudden damp coolness of the canyon mouth. The air changed, thicker, heavier, smelling of wet stone and old pine. He reached the bottom, boots hitting soft loam. He didn't stop, he couldn't. The pursuers' hooves echoed faintly on the ridge above, growing sharper, more deliberate. They had seen him drop, they knew where he'd gone. He pressed into the brush, the canopy closing around him like a lid. The temperature dropped. The light turned green and muted. The boy's head lolled against his shoulder, fever beginning to bloom beneath the skin. Elias felt the heat radiating through the wool coat, a new enemy added to the old ones. He kept moving. The choice was made. The flats were behind him. The descent was done. But the hunt was just beginning. He adjusted his grip, felt the boy's shallow breath against his neck, and stepped deeper into the shadowed throat of the valley. The wind shifted, the brush whispered, and somewhere ahead the ground waited. The juniper canopy swallowed the daylight whole, casting long, tangled shadows that pooled on the forest floor like spilled ink. Elias moved through the thickets with deliberate care, his boots finding purchase on moss-slick roots and fallen pine needles. He tracked the fading hoofprints ahead, half concealed by wind-scattered leaves and the occasional scuff of animal paws. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. Someone had passed this way hours ago, moving fast, heading deeper into the basin. He didn't know if it was scout, settler, or wanderer. Out here it rarely mattered. Footprints were just directions written in dirt. The boy's breathing had changed. It was no longer shallow. It was wet. Each draw came with a faint rattle, the sound of fever burning through the lungs. Elias felt the heat radiating through the layers of cloth, searing his own chest with every step. He shifted the boy's weight, trying to keep the wounded side elevated, trying to catch a rhythm that wouldn't jolt the binding loose. His shoulders screamed, his thighs burned. The blue scarf was stained dark, stiff with dried blood and sweat. He tightened his grip. He didn't stop. He couldn't. The valley demanded movement. Stillness was death. Then the silence. It wasn't natural silence. It wasn't the quiet of rest. It was the heavy, suspended stillness of held breath. The wind, which had been pushing through the brush in steady, rhythmic gusts, suddenly died. The leaves stopped trembling. The distant chatter of jays cut off mid-cry. The forest went rigid. Elias froze, 1 foot raised, muscles coiled. He knew this stillness. He'd felt it on the plains before buffalo runs. He'd heard it in the high deserts before dust storms rolled in. It was the quiet of eyes watching, of feet waiting. He lowered his foot slowly, letting it settle on the damp earth without a sound. His hand drifted to his pistol, fingers resting lightly on the grip. He listened. A twig snapped, 50 yards ahead, left, not wind, too sharp, too deliberate. Then another, closer, right, a boot on dry wood. Then the soft rustle of leather, the faint scrape of a bowstring against a quiver. Elias' breath caught. He didn't move. He didn't look up. He let his ears do the work. The brush shifted. A shadow detached from a juniper trunk, then melted into another. They weren't approaching. They were circling, testing, mapping his route, tribal scouts, moving with the practiced silence of men who'd spent their lives reading the land like a book. He exhaled slowly, forcing his heart to beat steady. He couldn't outrun them in this cover. He couldn't hide. He could only keep moving, hope the boy's condition forced him into a pace that didn't give him away, and trust that his footprints would look like a desperate flight rather than a calculated path. He pressed forward, stepping over a fallen log, keeping his weight on the balls of his feet. Another sound broke the stillness. Distant, low, a drum, not the sharp crack of a war drum, but the slow, steady beat of a tracking rhythm. One strike, pause, two strikes, pause. It carried through the trees, muffled by distance but unmistakable. It wasn't meant to intimidate. It was meant to coordinate, to close the net. Elias felt the sound vibrate in his teeth, in his ribs, in the hollow space behind his sternum. Every beat measured his distance. Every pause told him they were gaining. The boy shivered violently against him, a sudden spasm that racked his thin frame. Elias stopped, bracing himself against a thick pine trunk, and felt the boy's forehead burning. The fever had taken hold. His skin was slick with sweat, his lips cracked and pale, his breathing shallow and rapid. The blue scarf wasn't enough. The wound was closing over bad, trapping heat, turning infection into a silent thief. Elias knew he needed water, he needed shade, he needed to let the boy rest long enough to drop the temperature. But the drums wouldn't wait, the scouts wouldn't wait. He made a gamble. He set the boy down gently against the roots of a sprawling cedar, keeping the wounded arm propped, then unscrewed his own canteen. He poured a small stream over a clean strip of canvas from his saddlebag, then pressed it to the boy's neck and wrists where the blood ran close to the surface. The boy whimpered, a faint, broken sound, but didn't wake. Elias worked quickly, wiping the sweat from his face, adjusting the binding, feeling for the pulse. It was faster now, thready but present. He gave the boy 2 drops of water on the lips, then stood. He couldn't stay. He couldn't leave him. The compromise was agony. He picked him up again, feeling the dead weight settle against his chest, and stepped back into the brush. The terrain grew steeper. The ground sloped upward, forcing Elias into a slower, more careful climb. Every step sent a fresh wave of fire through his thighs. His boots slipped on loose shale. His breath came in ragged pulls. He ignored it. He focused on the drum. It was closer now. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats. They were flanking. He adjusted his course, angling toward a narrow gorge where the canyon walls pinched together, hoping the rock would mask his movement, hoping the echoes would confuse the trackers. He was halfway through the gorge when the sky cracked, not with thunder, with stone. A deep, grinding groan echoed from the high ledges above, followed by the sharp snap of ancient roots giving way. Elias looked up. The cliff face shuddered. A shelf of limestone broke free, followed by a cascade of boulders, dirt, and splintered timber. The rockslide didn't fall straight down. It sheared sideways, following the fault line, tearing through the gorge like a slow avalanche. Elias threw himself backward, shielding the boy with his body, rolling into the shallow depression beneath a limestone overhang. The impact hit like a cannon shot. Dust exploded. The air filled with grit and the deafening roar of crushing stone. Boulders the size of wagons slammed into the canyon floor, shattering the brush, burying the trail, obliterating the only cover Elias had left. When the dust finally settled, the gorge was unrecognizable. The narrow passage was choked with rubble. The escape route was gone. The defensive position he'd been counting on was buried under 3 feet of shattered rock. He coughed, wiping grit from his eyes, and pushed himself up. The boy was still against his chest, breathing, but the binding had shifted. Blood seeped fresh and dark. Elias cursed under his breath, a low, ragged sound, and quickly cinched the scarf tighter. His hands shook. His lungs burned. He was trapped in a dead end with a dying child and nowhere left to run. Then he saw them. High on the ridges above the rubble, silhouetted against the pale sky, stood figures, not riders, scouts on foot, Arapaho. They didn't move, they didn't call out, they just watched. And in their hands, held at rest but ready to draw, were bows, ash wood, horsehair strings, arrowheads of flint and iron. They lined the ledge, spaced evenly, a silent wall of judgment. The drums had stopped. The forest held its breath again, but this time the silence wasn't waiting for movement, it was waiting for a decision. Elias stood slowly, feeling the weight of every eye on him. He didn't reach for his pistol, he didn't raise his hands. He just held the boy tighter, feeling the faint, erratic pulse against his palm, and looked up at the ridge. He had crossed the salt flats. He had survived the descent. He had walked into the throat of the valley with nothing but a promise and a fading scarf. Now the land had run out of room. The only path left was through. One of the figures stepped forward, older, tall, wearing a headdress of braided eagle feathers and a cloak of worn buffalo hide. His face was lined, his eyes sharp and unreadable. He raised one hand, not in threat, in recognition. He looked at the silver armband, he looked at the blue scarf, he looked at Elias. The boy stirred against him, a weak, shuddering breath escaping his lips. His fingers curled barely around Elias' wrist, a grip, faint but there. Elias didn't move, he didn't speak. He just stood in the dust beneath the boughs, carrying the weight of a life that wasn't his, waiting for the next word to fall. The drums were gone, the chase was over. What remained was the ground beneath his boots, the boy against his chest, and the quiet, terrible understanding that survival was no longer the goal. It was the test. If you rode with me this far, you know the frontier doesn't hand out mercy. It only trades in weight. We've dragged Elias through blinding salt flats, down crumbling escarpments, and straight into a gorge where a rockslide stole his cover and a ring of drawn bows stole his exit. He's standing in the dust with nothing but a dying boy, a blood-stained blue scarf, and a promise he never asked to make. But survival was never the prize. Out here, survival is just the opening act. What comes next is the real trial. Chief Owanee steps out of the brush with a war council that doesn't care for excuses, a judgment weighed in silence, and a cottonwood post where the slow, agonizing drip of spilled water will count down Elias' fate. Will his quiet confession hold back the arrows, or will the valley finally collect its debt? If this trail's got you holding your breath, do me a solid. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me exactly where you're watching from. I want to see how many territories this story's reached, and I read every single one. Now, let's step back into the dust. The dust settled in slow, heavy sheets, coating Elias' tongue and gritting between his teeth. He stood knee-deep in shattered limestone and splintered juniper, the boy's dead weight anchored against his chest, his boots sinking slightly into the slick red clay that pooled at the base of the gorge. The silence above the ridge didn't break. It thickened. The Arapaho scouts hadn't moved, hadn't shouted, hadn't drawn their bows to fire. They simply watched, a ring of dark silhouettes against the bruised evening sky, their stillness more terrifying than any charge. Then the older chief stepped forward, his buffalo hide cloak whispering against the rock, his moccasins leaving no mark on the damp earth. Chief Owanee. Elias had heard the name whispered around trading posts and campfires, always followed by the same two words, "Don't cross him." Owanee stopped 10 paces away. His face was carved from hard years, lined with the deep grooves of sun, wind, and decisions that had cost men their lives. His eyes were dark, unreadable, fixed first on the tarnished silver armband, then on the faded blue scarf, and finally on Elias' face. He spoke in a low, measured tone, the Arapaho language flowing like water over stone. A warrior beside him, younger, with a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, translated without inflection. "The chief asks what you carry, not the boy, the reason." Elias' throat was raw. His shoulders trembled from the strain of holding the boy upright, but he didn't shift his stance. He didn't look away. He was bleeding out, Elias said, his voice rough but steady. "I couldn't leave him." The younger warrior translated. Owanee's expression didn't change. He raised a hand. From the brush behind him, 6 warriors stepped into the clearing. They moved as one, the soft scrape of leather, the sharp click of wood on bowstring, the synchronized sound of arrows being knocked echoed across the red clay, a rhythmic mechanical promise that carried more weight than any threat. 6 tips fletched with hawk feathers leveled at Elias' chest. The air grew tight, suffocating. The boy stirred against him, a faint whimper escaping his cracked lips. "You are white," the translator said. "You walk on ground that is not yours. You carry blood that is sacred. The council demands your motive. Speak plain, or the arrows will answer for your hesitation." Elias felt the pulse in his own neck hammer against his collarbone. He knew what they wanted, a grand declaration, a plea for mercy, a bargaining chip. He had none. Out here, words were cheap. Only actions held value. Only truth survived the fire. He swallowed the dust in his throat, felt the cold silver of his wedding ring press against his palm where it gripped the boy's coat, and spoke without raising his voice. "My name is Elias Thorne," he said. "I was married to Clara Vance for 8 years. She died in a cabin fire 2 winters past. I was 3 miles away checking fence lines. I heard the horses scream. I ran. I wasn't fast enough. I've carried that 3 miles every day since." He paused, letting the confession settle into the heavy air. The warriors didn't lower their bows. The tension didn't break. It just shifted, sharpening into something quieter, more dangerous. "When I found the boy on that ridge, I didn't see a chief's heir. I saw a kid bleeding in the dirt. I saw the same chance I didn't take for my wife. I'm not crossing for honor. I'm not crossing for peace. I'm carrying him because if I drop him now, I'm the same man who let his wife burn. I'll carry him home. Whatever it costs, however it ends, that's the only truth I have." The translator spoke. Owanee listened. His dark eyes never left Elias' face. For a long moment, nothing moved except the slow rise and fall of the boy's chest against Elias' arm. Then Owanee lowered his hand. The warriors didn't lower their bows, but the arrows didn't fly. He turned slightly, gesturing toward a massive cottonwood tree that stood at the edge of the red clay basin, its roots exposed like knotted veins, its branches heavy and broad. 2 warriors moved forward, hands on rawhide ropes, faces impassive. "The chief hears your words," the translator said. "He does not yet believe them, but he will not waste an arrow on a man who speaks his grief like a prayer. You will be bound. You will wait. The council will decide if your promise is worth the blood it will cost us to keep." Elias didn't resist. He gently lowered the boy to the ground, arranging him in the shallow shade of the cottonwood's trunk, pressing his own duster over the boy's shoulders. He stepped back, hands open at his sides, and let the warriors wrap the rawhide around his wrists, binding them tightly behind his back before securing him to the rough bark of the post. The rope bit into his skin, cutting off circulation, forcing his shoulders into a rigid, aching line. They didn't gag him. They didn't blindfold him. They simply stepped back, rejoining the council circle that had formed around the clearing. The sun dipped below the ridge, casting long, bleeding shadows across the red clay. The temperature dropped fast, the desert heat giving way to a sharp, biting chill that seeped through Elias' sweat-soaked shirt. The boy's breathing grew steadier, the fever still present but no longer spiking out of control. Elias leaned his head back against the cottonwood, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second, then forcing them open. He wouldn't sleep. He couldn't afford to lose focus, not with arrows pointed at his ribs, not with a child's life resting on his spine. Then came the sound that anchored him to the agonizing passage of time, a slow, steady drip. Someone had left a canteen near the base of the post, its leather punctured by a stray shard of limestone from the rockslide. Water gathered in a small hollow, filled to the brim, then spilled over the edge in a single heavy drop. Plip. It hit the clay. Plip. It echoed in the quiet clearing. Plip. Each drop was a metronome counting down an invisible sentence. Elias watched it pool, watched it spread into the red dirt, watched the dark stain lengthen as the shadows stretched across the basin. The tribe didn't move toward him. They stood in a loose semicircle, voices low and rhythmic, debating in Arapaho. He caught fragments through the translator's occasional interjections. White man's debt asterisk, treaty lines broken, blood for blood asterisk, the boy's life is sacred, the outsider's is not. The words wove together into a tapestry of judgment, each thread pulling tighter around Elias' chest. Hours passed. The sky turned from bruised purple to deep indigo. Stars emerged, cold and indifferent. The drip of the canteen became a torture. His wrists went numb, then burned, then throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. His knees locked. His back screamed against the rough bark. He shifted his weight, trying to ease the pressure, but the rawhide held fast. He focused on the boy, the shallow rise of his chest, the faint glint of the silver armband in the starlight, the blue scarf now stiff and dark but still holding. He whispered to himself, barely audible, just to keep his mind from fracturing under the weight of the waiting. Clara, I'm trying to be better. The council's debate grew louder. Not angry, urgent, fingers pointed, shoulders squared. The younger warriors paced at the edges of the clearing, restless, eager for a directive. Owanee sat on a woven mat near the fire pit, unmoving, his face illuminated by the low glow of embers that hadn't yet been banked. He watched Elias the way a hawk watches a field, patient, calculating, waiting for the wind to shift. A sudden gust swept through the basin, carrying the scent of pine resin and distant rain. The cottonwood branches groaned. The canteen's drip quickened. Shadows merged into darkness. Then a new sound cut through the murmurs of the council, distant, faint at first, then clearer, the rhythmic thud of hooves on hardpan, not tribal ponies. Heavy iron-shod, government stock moving in a tight formation. The council fell silent. Heads turned toward the ridge, Owanee's hand rose, warriors slipped into the brush, silent as smoke. The translator stepped back, eyes narrowing. Elias felt the shift in the air like a pressure drop before a storm. The valley wasn't just holding its breath. It was bracing for impact. The night deepened, the hooves drew closer, and Elias, bound to the post, knew the test wasn't over. It had only just begun to sharpen its teeth. Dawn broke over the Cimarron Basin like a slow bruise, bleeding pale gold through the eastern ridge. The cold had settled into Elias' bones, heavy and unyielding, his wrists raw and swollen against the cottonwood post, his shoulders stiff from hours of rigid confinement. He hadn't slept. He hadn't moved more than necessary to breathe. The canteen had finally run dry, leaving only a cracked leather shell and a dark stain on the red clay. The boy lay wrapped in the duster beside the roots, his breathing shallow but even, his fever broken by the night's chill. The silver armband caught the first slanting light, a quiet testament to a debt unpaid. Elias watched the horizon, muscles coiled, waiting for the council's verdict. Instead, he got the sound of chains. Heavy iron links clinked against saddle leather, boots struck the hardpan, voices loud and rough speaking in the flat, authoritative cadence of territorial law. The war council emerged from the brush, moving with deliberate precision, flanking a line of captured riders, 3 of them. Bound at the wrists, dust-caked, eyes wide with a mixture of defiance and fear. At their center rode a man in a tarnished tin star, his coat torn at the shoulder, his face split by a fresh cut along the jawline. U.S. Deputy Marshal Josiah Vance. No relation to the scout. A man whose name Elias had seen on wanted posters and homesteader notices. A man who'd spent the last 2 years enforcing treaty lines with a rifle and a badge. The valley's fractured peace hadn't just teetered, it had shattered, and the Marshal's arrival was the final piece falling into place. Owanee stepped forward, his cloak brushing the damp earth. He didn't speak to the prisoners, he looked at Elias. The translator remained silent. The council formed a tight ring, bows lowered but hands resting on quivers, their eyes fixed on the captive lawman, then shifting to the bound cowboy. The tension in the basin changed shape. It was no longer a test of survival. It was a transfer of weight. The marshal spat blood into the dust, glaring up at Owanee. "You break federal law by holding me savage," he snarled, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "You think a few arrows and stolen treaties give you sovereignty. The cavalry's 3 days out. You'll burn for this, all of you." Owanee didn't flinch. He turned his head slowly, meeting Elias' exhausted gaze. Then with deliberate, unhurried motion, he reached into the folds of his cloak and withdrew a rolled bundle of thick, aged paper. The edges were frayed. The wax seal was broken. He stepped toward Elias, ignoring the marshal's curses, and pressed the bundle into Elias' bound hands. The paper was heavy, official. Stamped with territorial authority and signed by 3 commissioners, 2 homestead representatives, and the chief's own mark, a hawk pressed in dark ink. The stolen treaty. The one that had been ripped from the territorial archive in Cimarron Creek the week before. The one both sides claimed justified their next strike. "The white man's law says land belongs to paper," Owanee said in English, his voice low and clear, carrying without translation. "Our law says land belongs to those who keep it alive. The marshal rode with men who burned 3 winter camps. My warriors rode with boys who stole cattle from starving homesteaders. Both sides bleed for pride." Both sides lie to themselves. You carried my son's heir through salt and stone. You spoke your grief without armor. You stand in my camp with your wrists bound, yet you do not beg. He leaned closer, his dark eyes locking onto Elias. The valley's peace does not rest on arrows. It rests on the man who chose to carry weight when he could have run. I place the papers in your hands because you are no longer a white man or an outsider. You are the bridge. You will speak for both. You will hold the line, or the valley burns. Elias' breath caught, the rough paper pressed against his numb palms. He felt the weight of it, not just the parchment, but the implication. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. The Marshal was a prisoner. The chief was handing a captured treaty to a bound cowboy. The council watched silent. The warriors held their positions. The boys slept. And Elias realized with a cold, staggering clarity that the rescue had never been about one life. It had been a catalyst. A single act of refusal to let the world keep spinning toward ruin. Now the world expected him to stop it. He didn't try to free his hands. He didn't look away from Owanee. He lowered his gaze to the treaty, feeling the texture of the ink, the weight of the signatures, the fragile thread of a truce held together by desperation. He thought of Clara. He thought of the 3 miles he'd run too late. He thought of the salt flats, the canteen's drip, the synchronized click of bowstrings. He thought of the boy's faint grip on his wrist, and he knew without doubt what he had to say. "I don't want your war," Elias said, his voice rough but clear, carrying across the red clay basin. "And I don't trust your law, Marshal." He lifted the treaty slightly, letting the morning light catch the wax seal. "But I'll hold the line. You release the prisoners. You pull your posses back past the survey markers. You let the camps rebuild. And in return, the chief's hunters stay east of the dry creek. The stolen cattle go back to the claim. The treaty stays unburned. You don't get to pick sides anymore. You get to live together. Or you get to watch the cavalry come in and take everything anyway. I'm not asking. I'm stating what keeps this valley from turning to ash." The Marshal's face flushed red. "You have no authority." "I have the papers," Elias interrupted, his tone flat, unyielding. "And I have the boy who wears your chief's mark. And I have the chief who just handed me the only thing that matters, a choice. You want to hang me for trespass, do it. But you'll do it knowing you're burning your own peace to do it. You want to ride me down for carrying Arapaho blood. Ride, but you'll be riding past men who just saw a white man hold a treaty instead of a rifle. The cavalry doesn't care about your grudges, they care about control. You keep fighting each other, you hand them the valley on a silver plate. You step back, you keep your homes, you keep your camps, you keep your sons." Silence fell over the basin, heavy and absolute. The wind stilled. Even the distant birds held their tongues. Owanee watched Elias, his expression unreadable, but his posture had shifted. The rigid tension of judgment had softened into something else. Assessment, recognition. He turned to the translator, spoke a single word. The younger warrior stepped forward, drew a knife, and sliced the rawhide binding Elias' wrists. Elias' arms fell forward, circulation flooding back in a wave of fire and Pinzan needles agony. He didn't rub them. He straightened his spine, feeling every joint protest, every muscle scream. He stepped forward, placing the treaty on the ground between the Marshal's boots and the chief's moccasins. He didn't bow, he didn't kneel. He simply stood, a tired man in a torn coat, holding the space between 2 worlds that had forgotten how to share it. The chief nodded once. The translator stepped back to the council. The warriors lowered their bows completely. The Marshal didn't speak. He just stared at the papers, then at Elias, the defiance in his eyes fracturing into something closer to calculation. The valley hadn't been saved, not yet, but it had been given a chance, a fragile, bleeding, impossible chance. And it rested on the shoulders of a man who hadn't asked to carry it but had refused to drop it anyway. Owanee turned toward the ridge, raising his hand toward the sky. The council dispersed, moving with quiet purpose toward the horses, the prisoners, the campfires. The boy stirred, opening his eyes slowly, dark and clear, finding Elias' face. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silver armband caught the light, the blue scarf held, the treaty lay between them. Elias exhaled, long and slow, feeling the weight of the mandate settle over him like a cloak he hadn't chosen but would now wear until it wore out. The rescue was over. The command had begun. and the Badlands finally held their breath. The valley did not gather in silence. It gathered in the heavy, metallic scrape of boot heels on dry earth, in the low mutter of men who had spent months nursing grudges like open wounds, and in the rhythmic stamp of pony hooves that vibrated through the red clay basin. Elias stood at the center of it all, his back to the cottonwood post, his wrists finally free but his shoulders locked tight beneath the weight of what came next. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of wood smoke, damp sage, and the faint, coppery tang of old blood. The treaty papers lay on the ground where he had placed them, frayed edges catching the pale dawn light, a fragile bridge between two worlds that had spent a decade learning how to hate each other. They arrived in waves. First the Homesteaders, spilling down the ridge from the Cimarron Creek claim line. 30 men, maybe more. They wore patched wool and dust-caked canvas, rifles slung across their backs or gripped in calloused hands. Their leader was a broad-shouldered man named Vance, a homesteader who had lost 2 sons to raiding parties and 2 more winters to drought. His face was carved from sun and sorrow, his jaw set in a line that brooked no argument. Behind him, the men shifted their weight, eyes hard, fingers resting near triggers. They didn't want peace. They wanted restitution. They wanted the cattle returned. They wanted the border drawn in iron. From the eastern brush came the Arapaho War Party. They moved with the quiet precision of men who knew the land better than their own names. Owanee walked at their front, his buffalo cloak heavy, his face unreadable. Behind him stood 12 warriors, bows unstrung but hands resting on quivers, eyes tracking the homesteaders with the cold patience of predators who had already decided the hunt. The tension between the two lines was a physical thing, a taut wire stretched across the basin, humming with the memory of stolen stock, burned camps, broken treaties, and graves dug in hardpan. Elias felt the wire pull against his ribs. He looked down at the treaty. He looked at Harlan's rigid posture. He looked at Owanee's steady gaze. He knew what was coming. It always came down to this. Paper versus blood, claim versus memory. A man's life measured against the distance between 2 fences. Harlan stepped forward first, his boots crunching on the gravel. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. We want our cattle back, Thorne, every last head. We want the border markers reset to the creek, and we want the chief's word that his boys keep their arrows nocked but their hands clean. You got that paper, you hold it, make them sign it, make them honor it. Owanee didn't look at Harlan, he looked at Elias. His translator stepped slightly aside, but the chief's voice carried without it, low and measured. The white man's paper took our winter grounds, it drew a line through our graves, it called our hunting theft and called your fences law. The council does not bow to ink. The council demands blood for broken borders, 3 camps burned, 12 ponies taken. 4 sons unreturned. The boy lives because you carried him, that debt is paid, the land's debt is not. The wire tightened, men shifted, rifles creaked, a horse snorted, the air grew thick with the unspoken certainty that one spark would turn the basin into a slaughter pen. Elias felt the weight of it settle over him like a wet blanket. He could hand the treaty to Harlan. He could let it be signed, stamped, filed. It would buy a month of quiet, maybe 2. Then someone would cross a fence line, then a shot would ring out. Then the valley would burn. He could hand it to Owanee. He could let it be torn, buried, forgotten. The blood debt would demand payment. The homesteaders would ride. The cavalry would follow. The valley would still burn. Paper was not a bridge. It was a match. And he was tired of watching men strike it. Elias knelt, the gravel bit through his knees. He picked up the treaty, feeling the rough texture of the parchment, the faded ink, the broken wax seal that had once promised order. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small tin box. Inside were 3 wooden matches, kept dry, kept safe, kept for emergencies. He struck one against the stone. The flame caught, small and steady, casting a warm glow against the pale morning light. He didn't hesitate. He held the flame to the edge of the treaty. A collective breath sucked out of the clearing. Harlan's eyes widened. What in God's name are you doing? Owanee didn't move, but his warriors shifted, hands tightening on bow grips. The flame caught the dry edge. Paper curled, ink blackened. The smell of burning parchment filled the basin, sharp and acrid. Elias held it steady, watching the treaty curl into ash, watching the signatures vanish, watching the fragile lie of a border dissolve into smoke. He didn't drop it until it was nothing but a brittle skeleton of charred edges and floating cinders. He let the last piece fall to the red clay. It crumbled on impact. Harlan stepped back, face flushing dark. "You just burned our only leverage. You just handed them everything." "I burned the match," Elias said, his voice quiet but carrying across the basin. "So neither side can strike it." Owanee's eyes narrowed. "You destroy the law, you leave the land open to the hungry, you leave the dead unavenged." "I leave you alive," Elias replied. He stood slowly, feeling every joint ache, every muscle protest. He reached into his inner coat pocket again. This time he pulled out a folded document sealed with wax edged in worn leather. It was heavier than the treaty. Heavier because it wasn't about land or borders or treaties, it was about memory. It was his ranch deed, the 80 acres he and Clara had cleared with their own hands, the cabin where she had laughed, the porch where she had watched the rain, the soil where he had buried her wedding ring after the fire. It was the last tangible tie to the man he had been before the canyon, before the boy, before the Badlands decided to test him. He didn't hold it like a bargaining chip. He held it like a stone he was finally ready to drop. He stepped forward and placed the deed on the ground between the two lines. He didn't hand it to Harlan. He didn't hand it to Owanee. He let it lie in the dust, exposed, unguarded, a physical anchor to the cost of what he was about to demand. "I'm putting it down as collateral," Elias said. "If either side breaks this truce, if one bullet fires, if one fence is crossed with a rifle raised, the deed goes to the other side. I lose my home so you keep your sons. I sever my past so you can build a future that doesn't end in ash." Harlan's jaw worked. He looked at the deed. He looked at the charred remains of the treaty. He looked at the warriors. He looked at Elias. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Men shifted, boots scraped. The wire was vibrating so hard it threatened to snap. Elias didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He just looked at Harlan, then at Owanee, then at the ring of armed men on both sides. He let the quiet settle over them, heavy and absolute. Then he spoke, exactly 12 words. "Lower your rifles, return the cattle, share the creek, or ride out." The words landed like stones in still water. No echo, no flourish, just 6 stark choices, measured and final. They cut through the muttered threats, through the rigid pride, through the generations of grievance that had built the walls between them. They didn't ask for forgiveness. They didn't demand surrender. They demanded a decision. Harlan's hand twitched near his rifle stock. He stared at the deed. He stared at the ash. He stared at Elias' tired, unblinking eyes. The seconds stretched into minutes. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of smoke and dry sage. A crow called from the ridge. Then slowly, deliberately, Harlan unslung his rifle. He didn't toss it. He laid it on the ground beside his boots. The metallic clink against the gravel was sharp, clear, final. Behind him, another man did the same, then another. The sound multiplied, a cascading rhythm of wood and iron hitting earth. Clatter, clatter, clatter. It echoed across the basin, bouncing off the limestone walls, rolling down into the dry creek bed, a chorus of surrender that wasn't born of defeat but of exhaustion, of men finally too tired to keep feeding the fire. On the eastern line, Owanee watched. He didn't speak. He simply raised his hand. The warriors unstrung their bows. They didn't drop them. They laid them against their legs, hands resting lightly, eyes still sharp but no longer locked on killing. The tension didn't vanish. It transformed. It settled into something heavier, something that required maintenance, something that demanded work. Elias exhaled, a long, slow breath that carried 3 years of grief, 2 winters of running, and 1 promise kept. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his arms. He just stood in the center of the basin, surrounded by lowered guns, watching 2 sides of a broken valley choose to keep breathing instead of bleeding. The deed lay in the dust. The treaty was ash. The boy was safe. The command had been given. And the cost was already settling into his bones, quiet and permanent, a price he would pay for as long as the land held his footsteps. The valley held its breath. And for the first time in a decade, it didn't hold it for violence. It held it for peace. Time in the Cimarron Basin did not heal with fanfare. It healed in quiet increments. measured in the slow return of migratory birds to the contested creek beds, in the gradual softening of boot prints along the old fence lines, and in the unspoken agreements that replaced written treaties. The valley didn't celebrate, it simply adjusted. The cattle returned to the homesteaders' grazing plots. The Arapaho hunting parties moved east of the dry creek, leaving the western ridges to the settlers. The markers weren't redrawn with iron or ink. They were redrawn with respect, and the man who had drawn them didn't ask for credit, he asked only for the space to watch them hold. Elias rode alone now, not out of isolation but out of necessity. The borderlands required a presence that didn't belong to either side, a man who knew the weight of a homesteader's grievance and the memory of a tribal elder's loss. He rode a sturdy bay mare, her coat dusted with the pale red of the basin, her steps sure on the shifting trails. He carried no rifle across his saddle. He carried a canteen, a coil of rope, a weathered map, and a quiet reputation that preceded him like a shadow. Settlers nodded from their porch steps as he passed. They didn't wave. They didn't call out. They simply touched their hats, a gesture of acknowledgement that spoke of debt, of distance, of a truce that required careful tending. The Arapaho scouts watching from the high ridges did the same. A raised hand, a lowered bow, a shared silence that meant more than any council speech ever could. He didn't command with authority. He commanded with consistency. He rode the fault lines where trespass and survival still blurred, watching for the subtle signs of friction before it could harden into conflict. He checked water holes for silt. He noted which trails showed heavy use. He listened to the wind for the sound of approaching hooves. He didn't speak of the treaty. He didn't speak of the deed. He didn't need to. The valley remembered. And memory out here was a stronger law than paper. The boy recovered. It wasn't a sudden miracle. It was a slow, grueling process of fever breaking, wounds closing, strength returning. Elias never asked for his name. He never needed to. The silver armband was enough. But he watched the boy grow taller, steadier, his eyes losing the hollow weight of the canyon and gaining the quiet focus of a child who knew he had been carried when he should have been left. The chief's heir didn't seek him out. He didn't need to. The debt had been settled. The mandate had been transferred, and the boy in time would wear his father's cloak and learn to read the wind the way Owanee had. Elias would not be there to see it, but he would know it happened, and that was enough. The seasons turned. Summer bled into autumn, painting the basin in rust and gold. The juniper canopies thinned. The creek beds ran shallow but clear. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of pine resin and distant wood smoke. Elias rode a solitary patrol along the eastern ridge, his boots finding familiar paths, his eyes tracking the horizon out of habit rather than fear. Below him, the valley spread out like a quiet map of compromise. Settlers' cabins stood a respectful distance from Arapaho camp rings. Fences were mended with shared timber. Cattle grazed on shared grass. It wasn't perfect. It never would be, but it was breathing. And in a land that had spent a decade learning how to die, breathing was a victory. He stopped at a weathered fence post near the dry creek bed. The wood was gray with sun, split by frost, leaning slightly but still holding its ground. He dismounted, letting the bay mare graze on the sparse grass, and stepped toward the post. There, resting on the flat, splintered top, was a tarnished silver armband. The hawk and twisted pine were dull with dust but still visible. He hadn't placed it there. He hadn't asked for it to be left, but it was a message, not of gratitude, not of worship, of acknowledgement, a reminder that the line had been drawn not in blood but in choice, that a man's promise could outlast a treaty. That a valley could heal without forgetting its scars. He reached out, fingers brushing the cool metal. He didn't pick it up. He let it sit where it belonged, on the border, in the sun, between the past and the road ahead. He turned back to his horse, mounted slowly, feeling the familiar ache in his shoulders, the quiet weight in his chest, the steady rhythm of a life he hadn't planned but had finally accepted. He didn't look back as he rode west. He didn't need to. The valley was behind him, but it would follow him, in the wind, in the dust, in the quiet spaces where men chose not to fire. The Badlands didn't forgive, but they remembered. And Elias Thorne, a tired man with a faded blue scarf and a deed he no longer owned, had given them something worth keeping. Not a victory, not a triumph, just a chance. And sometimes in the frontier, that was the only legacy a man could buy. The sun dipped below the ridge, casting long shadows across the basin. The wind picked up, carrying the distant cry of a hawk. Creek bed ran dry, but the soil held moisture. The fences stood, the campfires burned, the valley breathed, and the man who had saved a boy burned a treaty and surrendered his past rode into the fading light, carrying no crown, claiming no glory, leaving only a quiet consequence that would outlast his footsteps. The armband rested on the post, the dust settled, the frontier held, and the story finally ended where it had begun, in the space between what was lost and what was chosen to stay. If this trail stayed with you long after the dust settled, hit like and subscribe to keep riding these forgotten frontiers with me. Drop a comment below and tell me exactly where you're listening from. Every territory adds another mile to our shared map. The frontier isn't built on grand victories. It's forged in the quiet choices we make when the world isn't watching. If Elias' journey left a mark on your heart, share it, pass it on, and keep your eyes on the horizon. The next trail is already waiting. Saddle up and ride on.